You know, sometimes in politics, it's the most unexpected events, the ones that make you do a double take, that offer the most profound lessons. What does a simple photo op between two political enemies really tell us about strategy? Well, it turns out, a whole lot. So picture this: the recent meeting between President Trump and New York's mayor-elect Zohran Mamdani. I mean, these are two guys who had been throwing words like fascist and communist at each other. You'd expect fireworks, right? But no. In the Oval Office, they were all smiles. The mood was surprisingly friendly, almost cooperative.
It's really easy to just write this off as, typical political theater. But what if it's more than that? This one single meeting actually sparked a really fascinating argument about political strategy, one that kind of forces us to question some of our most basic assumptions about how the game of politics should be played.
Okay, so at the very heart of this whole argument is a powerful and maybe a little unconventional analogy. It asks us to look at how we engage with our political opponents through a totally different lens.
Think about it this way. A lot of born-again Christians support Donald Trump, but at the same time, they also talk about a hope for his personal, spiritual conversion, for him to be saved. They give him this sort of grace, separating the political person from the possibility of personal change.
And that leads us to this really provocative thought. What if the left took on a similar mindset? Not in a religious way, of course, but in the sense of actually holding out hope that their opponents could change their hearts and minds, instead of just being written off as a lost cause.
When you put these two side by side, you really see what the argument is getting at. On one side, you've got this spiritual hope for salvation, which requires extending grace. The political version of that, then, isn't about agreeing on policy, it's about trying to find a human connection, an inroad, even with the people you disagree with the most.
So let's be super clear about something, because it's the most important point. This is not about caving on policy. It's not about suddenly agreeing with your opponent's platforms. The whole idea is an analogy for interpersonal strategy. It's about how you choose to engage with people, especially people you fundamentally disagree with.
All right, so if that's the proposed new strategy, what's the old way of doing things that's being critiqued here? Well, this argument really takes aim at a very common political posture we see all the time.
The critique is pretty blunt. It's that the left often seems to get stuck in a cycle of just pointing out what's wrong, shouting racist, sexist, transphobe into the wind without actually building any real power. There's a certain satisfaction, right? A comfort in knowing you're on the right side of history. But the argument is that this comfort comes at a huge cost, being politically effective.
So, what's the alternative then? Let's dig into this different path forward. The one that uses that weirdly cordial meeting between Mamdani and Trump as a kind of model for a new approach.
This proposed strategy isn't just a vague idea, it breaks down into some really clear steps. And it's not about being weak, it's about being smart. You take a firm stand on your principles. You're crystal clear about your differences. But then, and this is the hard part, you try to find a human connection, an inroad. And that means you have to drop your ego a little bit. It's about being principled and pragmatic at the same time.
Now, I know what some of you are probably thinking. This all sounds a little idealistic, maybe a bit naive, right? Well, this line of argument totally sees that coming and addresses the skepticism head-on.
And here it is, the big one. The idea that some opponents, some entire ideologies are just unreachable. That they're so dug in that even trying to engage is a total waste of time.
The response to this is actually pretty thoughtful. First, it suggests that those really rigid political stances are often just symptoms of deeper stuff going on. Second, it admits that changing someone's entire worldview is incredibly hard. Yeah, it's like moving a mountain, but it's not impossible. People do change. And finally, even tiny little shifts, these baby steps of change from an opponent, those are huge victories. They matter.
Okay, on to the second major objection. What if your opponent just isn't acting in good faith? What if, like Trump is so often accused of, it's all just a selfish political game and there's zero sincerity there? Now, the counterargument here is really sharp. It basically says, yeah, that might be completely true. But the lesson isn't actually about Trump's sincerity. The lesson is about your strategy. It's not about liking your opponents or even trusting them. It's about learning to think and act in a way that is more strategically effective no matter what their motives are. So this brings us to the ultimate goal. If the point isn't to convert every single opponent into a true believer who agrees with you on everything, then what's the end game of this whole approach?
And here's the key takeaway. This strategy basically frees you from an impossible job. You don't need everyone to adopt your entire worldview.
That's not the goal, and honestly, it's probably never going to happen anyway.
The real goal is this: building a broad-based coalition. It's a practical, strategic alliance. It's about finding just enough common ground with enough different kinds of people to actually achieve concrete political goals, even if you all disagree on a dozen other things. At the end of the day, it's about winning.
And that leaves us with one last, pretty challenging question that brings this whole argument full circle. Is the comfort that comes from knowing you're morally correct actually preventing the hard work of building a coalition that can win? And if it is, what are we willing to sacrifice for that feeling of just being right?